I think the title says it all, that masculinity does matter. And, I have focused a lot of my career on helping women, but what I'm seeing and couples, but what I'm seeing more and more of is that young men are struggling, older men are struggling. I teach a psychology of human sexuality class to hundreds of students a year. And every year I see the men's pain and their confusion and their isolation going up.
Hmm.
And so I think it's very, very important to provide a space to have open, honest, healing conversations that can heal what men are struggling with and to educate professionals and the lay public about the struggles young men are experiencing and men in general.
Any opportunity that I have to participate in the redefinition of masculinity, helping to free men from two-dimensional old models of masculinity into multidimensional models of masculinity that acknowledge the full humanity of men is an opportunity that I'm going to say yes to. And looking at the other speakers, I'm really honored to be one of them.
Well, when I first heard about this, I was so excited and thought, this is exactly the kind of conference that I would want to be part of. I've been practicing psychology and sex therapy specifically for 40 years, a little over 40 years now. And over the years, I have worked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of men. Men really have formed the basis of my practice. A lot of my work comes directly from urologists, where men with sexual concerns and sexual difficulties are going to go first, especially for dysfunction. If things are not working properly, they're going to go see their urologist, and their urologist, after ascertaining that medically everything was good, they would refer for sex therapy to me. So I spent 40 plus years sitting with men, working with men, helping men. And frankly, at least in a psychotherapy perspective, I don't think there's been enough attention given to men and psychologically and sexually what's going on with them. I think the narrative about male sexuality and why men behave the way they behave sexually is really sort of limited and reductionistic. I think it's much more complicated than people think. And so, after all of these years of sitting with men who are struggling, really hurting, really in pain, and having that pain manifest itself in some sexual difficulties, I do everything I can, every chance I can, to sort of advocate and educate about what I've learned about working with men who are having sexual difficulties.
Well, hi, my name's Christopher Brown. I'll jump in and go first. So the title, for first and foremost, Masculinity Matters, it matches a personal journey I've been on that really intensified during the Me Too movement. Is what does it mean to be a man in this culture? And I've refined that question as what does it mean to be this man? And for me, as a psychotherapist and sex therapist in practice for over 20 years, what I have really found is that for all the generalizations I know, whether they be about third wave feminism or orgasm gaps, all very real and present problems, that when individuals come into my practice, I'm dealing with a sample size of one. So, what does it mean to be this man? The person coming to this conference. And that journey is really fraught and it is really rewarding. But people like me, we need guides, we need permissions, we need information. And the fact that you put together this conference to provide that from so many different rich sources, oh, I want to be a part of that, not just as a speaker, but as a participant. So, yeah, the Masculinity Matters is really so resonant to my personal journey. I'm really here as a speaker, so I get to be a participant and hear the wisdom of the collective.
I'll say. I'm Crystal DeSantis, and I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist and author. And I was drawn to this conference because, in working with couples, kind of off of what Chris was saying, is I've heard from a lot of men who wonder, is masculinity now passe? Like, is there no more room for the masculine in this new paradigm? And I really wanted to emphasize that no, absolutely not, right? And so that's the work I do with couples is, we need balance. Masculinity absolutely matters. It's actually crucial for the way forward for couples, for sex. And yet we need to have a conversation about how masculinity looks different these days. And so that's why I'm really excited to be part of this conversation and part of this conference. But again, the title Masculinity Matters, I think is such an affirming message for so many men out there. And it's a really needed message at this point. And I'm really happy to be a part of this panel.
I'm Andrea Bertoli. I'm a certified sex educator and I work as a pleasure coach. And for me, I got to attend last year. There were so many great names on the roster at the Masculinity Matters Conference last year. And it became a nice relationship to build with Kiss and Tell and the community there. And I wanted to offer my perspective as somebody who works very specifically on the sex side of coaching and education. And I also do a lot of classes and workshops locally and online. And I see a kind of segment of the population where men really want to do better because they want to get beyond, like Crystal, like you said, like kind of into this new paradigm, like what are we working with, right? So I feel like in the maybe 90s and the early 2000s, we had this swing towards like, the new age man, and that left behind the men who were more, kind of traditionally masculine. Now we're in this like new paradigm. And what does that mean? How do we be the masculine version of who we are, like Christopher said, and also still be an amazing partner, a fabulous lover, a concerned citizen, like caring about climate change, caring about animals, caring about all the things that one person might care about, while still being, hot and playful and fun and clear in who they are as a sexual person. So it's been fun to do this work with men and with couples to help them really figure out, like, you get to figure this out for you and what this means for your particular relationship or your particular sexual dynamic. So I'm excited to bring my wisdom to the group to help, share what I've seen, and also, like most people have said, to really learn from the rest of the collective, because there's still a bunch of great names on the roster this year. So I also am excited to learn.
Thank you, Adrian. I'm gonna have to be a pain and say that where Adrian is right now at 7 in the morning, which is why she made the Masculinity Matters conference comment, and so the literacy conference. So I understand. If I just woke up, I'd do the same.
And I'm Chris Kilmartin. I'm a psychologist and a retired college professor. I've been interested in men and masculinity my entire career. Wrote a textbook about men and masculinity. I've written it like 6 times, in fact. Eventually, I'll get it right, maybe. I'm interested in a lot of different issues with regards to men and masculinity, and as my goal at this stage of my career is to become irrelevant, because so that I am hoping at some point people will have learned about this stuff so well that they won't need me anymore. That I'm, I'm getting old. I'll go play golf. I'm fine with that, But I think there are a great deal of problems associated with some versions of masculinity, not all. And I've been involved pretty extensively in one of them, and that is violence. That in the United States, men commit almost 90% of violent crimes. Now we know that most men are not violent, but most violent people are men, and that's not doing anybody any good, including the men. And so I think that we need to explore, I think of masculinity as a social pressure to behave and experience ourselves in the ways that the culture says is appropriate for the bodies that we're perceived as having. And this has been something of a mantra of mine the last 15 years, is it's very difficult to resist a pressure that you cannot name. And
Mm.
so my goal in my career has always been to help men name it and put them in position to make conscious choices about their own behavior and their own lives, rather than just going along with the program.
The people I work with are either couples in distress or college students. But from that, what I've seen is the old school of traditional masculinity, don't show your feelings, be instrumental, take care of things, has crumbled. But there's nothing that's so certain to take its place. Like men are very confused, like they still have to abide by some of those old messages, but then there's new things, that they need to do or that their partners want them to do. And I think there's sometimes confusing messages. I think, sometimes that men are supposed to be two things, two diametrically opposed things at once, strong and masculine and stoic and soft and connecting and emotional. And I think these messages, I think it's kind of, we know what traditional masculinity is, but modern masculinity is all over the map and it's nothing clear. It's very amorphous and it may depend on where you live, your culture, etc. So I think that that's part of the confusion and angst and pain and insecurity that men and especially young men are experiencing.
I really think of traditional masculinity as a myth about men, a myth about how men feel, how men relate, what men want, how men show up in the world.
Mhm.
And that myth ends up historically being reinforced with violence and insult, social ostracization. And I think of modern masculinity as a masculinity that allows men to be what we really are, much more diverse, much more different from one another in many ways than any single image of masculinity could be. And so we really have the opportunity in modern masculinity, instead of trying to look at one model of how I should be, we get to ask ourselves, who am I? And what are the men that are like me in the world? How do they show up? And how can I be more like them, which really just means more like myself?
Well, I think that's such an interesting question, and I think we can really look at that on several different levels. One of the things, and I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're asking, but one of the things that I've noticed among men, especially young men today, that seems to be so different than what we would see in men, a generation even ago, is that young men today are really, really struggling.
Mhm.
What we have seen in recent years is, women have really been thriving. I mean, obviously, there's a lot still to do, but if you look at sort of how change has occurred, for women over the last couple of generations, largely due to their own advocacy. They are now representing the majority of college graduates. They are representing the majority of professional school graduates. They are moving up and up in the corporate world. I mean, women, they have really just been able to take hold and provide so much more for women and provide good role models for young women. Men today are lost. You don't see school shooters who are girls and women. You don't see this kind of violence. You don't see this proliferation of sexual offenses being committed by women that you do for men. And one of the other things that I often think about is, we talk a lot about, these days, failure to launch and just kids who graduate from college or don't come out of their parents' basement. You never hear anybody say that about their daughters. You hardly ever say that about their daughters. It's about these men. Men have not responded well to the changes in society. Men have not learned how to redefine and expand masculinity and what being a man really is about or should be about. And so what's happening is they are just falling further and further behind, I think. They have fewer and fewer opportunities, not because, I'm certainly not saying, well, women or other minorities should have less opportunities. Far from it. Not at all. There's plenty of room for everybody, but men have not reinvented themselves. Men have not expanded. Men do not have good role models, for that process either. So I've become very concerned about that part, which of course is beyond just the sexual part, even though it's part of sexuality. It's obviously beyond just the sexual functioning part. But I also find that in my work with young men these days, these are the issues that they are facing and struggling with. And I think that's a big difference than the way it was, traditionally when we talked about masculinity.
Well, I'm not sure that there is a traditional masculinity, although I think that when we think of traditional masculinity, again, it's a social pressure. It's not like how every man ever was. It's in the air, and people's individual reactions to that pressure are widely variable. We all know men who don't like sports and women who do. We all know men who love children and women who don't want to be in the same room with a child. We all know men who are emotional and women who are not. So we have to be clear when we're talking about masculinity is it's not stuffed into every person in the same way. It's in the air. Now, most people would think about traditional masculinity as being certainly the American version, a mainstream American version of traditional masculinity, of being very stoic, being aggressive, but also all these things like being a provider, taking care of people. That's where the word husband comes from. Husband is taking care. And so now we're living in a new era now, certainly in the United States. We're changing the very definition of what a family is. And if we just stick with just traditional heterosexual couples, well, you need two incomes. And the old deal, I think the old traditional masculinity deal was, men would succeed for women and women would emote for men. And women are succeeding for themselves a lot more than they used to be, much more oppressed even than they are today. So if women are succeeding for themselves, then guess what men have to learn how to do? Emote for themselves. And I think that we're seeing both inside the home and outside the home is a merging of roles, or a greater range of choice about how we're going to deal with these kind of gender dynamics. So it's very much fueled by changes in our economy and our laws and just a whole wide variety of forces that we need to understand better.
Yeah. I would love to jump on what you were saying, Chris. Yes, as thinking about the difference between like the traditional or way of being, right, the traditional masculine versus the modern masculine, or the way we talk about it. The kind of what I see is the evolution from kind of being objectified of like a human doing, right? So that you do for, men's job is to do for, to what does it mean to be a man just as a human, right? And so it's the expansion from just being a human doing to a human being. And I talk about this often in my work of, the male is the performer, right? The male is the provider, the male is the protector. And now we're expanding it, because even like Chris pointed out that, the traditional tropes of masculinity didn't work for a lot of men because it is such a limiting stereotype, right? And Tony Porter talks about the man box and the expectations placed on men. And a lot of it has to do with what men have to do rather than who men get to be. And so that's really how I like to frame this kind of evolution of masculinity into, you know, allowing men the full range of human, right? And being a full person rather than just an object or a performance.
I can add something as well. And again, bringing it back to sex and sexuality is really helping people relearn who they are in relationship and in sex is one of the things that I love to do and is really important to do. And I think we're seeing such a big generational shift with that, where all the different studies that I see talk about how the newest generation of Gen Z, right? Gen Alpha, like they have such a more expansive definition of sexuality and gender as well. So I'm so curious that we're not only seeing this big paradigm shift, but we're also seeing this generational shift of how people identify. Like when I was growing up as a bisexual in the early 90s in the suburbs, I didn't know any bisexuals. I didn't have TikTok. I didn't have Instagram to tell me like that was okay and that was possible. And so I think about all the young kids growing up now who have a completely different understanding of sex and gender. And I agree with you, Chris, that there is, we're kind of steeped in it, right? So I like that you said like it's in the air. Like Glennon Doyle talks about this kind of toxicity being like the tea that we're all steeped in, right? Like we're all just like floating in this. And I think that's a helpful metaphor. And we're seeing so many new flavors come into the mix. And I think it's just fascinating to watch. And it's fascinating to see it kind of play out on this very individualized level.
You know, as everyone is giving their answers, just a message to the audience, please listen to all these speakers. It's a commitment of time and it's worth it, because what comes to me is if you listen to any one of us, you're going to get a piece of what all this means. But if you listen to all of us, you're going to start to get the mosaic of what it means to be a modern masculine man. And my piece that I would add into this is that I think the biggest difference for me is unskilled, unchecked empathy. Now that I know the dilemmas of others, I have occupied a very powerful, by just luck of birth, a straight, white, cisgendered body. And I have gone through my life with that version of normal. And now that I have gone through decades of social work training and clinical work and sitting with other people's lived experiences, I have empathy for other people's experience of the world who don't check all the power boxes that I do. And it is overwhelmingly heartbreaking. And I think these aren't just clinicians who are having this experience. These are human beings. These are men who are not skilled in how to hold space, how to emotionally regulate themselves, how to tolerate distress. And now that I am getting empathy and I'm not trained to hold it, the emotional capacity is really the demand here. To be a modern masculine man, I must have distress tolerance. I must be able to understand, process, and hold space for all this empathy. Meanwhile, be me, and a version of me that is good to my partners, to myself, to the world. That is an emotional task that I'm trained for as a clinician, but this is not what we're taught in general. This is not what we're taught in schools. This is not what I was taught in my family, right? So there is an education gap of emotional intelligence that is now rigorously demanded of men who are woefully ill prepared for it. So I think that skill and that skill set is required to be the kind of men that I want us to be, that I want me to be. And it's on me to try to teach that in places like this conference that is open to the public. And yes, it's for professionals too, but it's really for the public to get these skills out there. Because the more we learn about people's pain, the more we have to broaden to hold that and act from a place that is genuine to us, but it encompasses the experiences of other people from perspectives that we weren't taught to understand.
100%. I think the general public actually needs this information. You know, I am thrilled for all of the attention that women's issues have gotten across the years, and they have been in the public eye. I do not think men's issues, men's struggles are in the public eye. And I think it's really important for that to be elevated in our culture because, you know, you can't have a relationship when one person is struggling. That's, well, you can, but it's not as effective, right? It's not as positive. And men are struggling. And I think men need to understand this. They need to understand why they're struggling. They need reassurance. They need strategies. And at the same time, people who interact with men, mothers, sisters, girlfriends, wives, you know, I think we all need the information as well.
And if you don't mind me adding, men interacting with men.
Oh, yes, please. Yes, absolutely. I missed that.
Yeah.
So thank you for pointing that out. Yes. So I think you're offering an opportunity to bring these issues to the public eye, and I think anyone who goes will benefit.
I think that the tools that we're sharing with each other as clinicians are the tools that us as clinicians are bringing to the public. So cut out the intermediary, get the wisdom straight from the source, decide for yourself how you feel about it and how it would apply in your life. And then if you are in a therapeutic situation, you can debate, well, here's what I heard on this conference. Here's how it spoke to me. Here's an author. Here's a speaker who had a model of masculinity that I really resonate with. So instead of being handed something from somebody else, you get the opportunity to perceive a number of different models, to find the ones that best fit you. You get to be empowered in that way.
But these are things that the general public, I think, really needs to know that this is what's going on. People are so isolated today, more than ever. Men in particular. I don't know if you're seeing some of the early data that's coming out post-COVID, but during COVID, women have just on almost every mental health measure have done better than men, largely because women have been much more proactive and much better at maintaining their social relationships. They were doing social Zoom calls and distanced walking and all this kind of stuff, whereas most men, or at least a lot of men who weren't going into the office anymore, were interacting with no one. They were watching television. They were sitting home. They became more and more isolated. All of those problems that we traditionally saw with men about not being great communicators or having some difficulties establishing relationships have been multiplied, I don't know, 100-fold, since COVID. So this is something that affects the general public. I think men really need to be talking about how to connect better with other men so that they can build better social networks. I think that and again, my perspective is an existential perspective. I practice existential psychotherapy, and existential psychotherapy is very, very much a relational, form of psychotherapy. It's a recognition that we do not live in vacuums. We should not be isolated. That we need other people in order to be, psychologically healthy. And so trying to even help men get some ideas about how to connect with other men, I think would be a good thing for the general public. Also, when it comes to just the sexuality, part of it, which I know is a big piece of this, there's a slide that I show sometimes when I'm lecturing, and I'm sure you've probably seen it. It's used a lot, but basically it's trying to illustrate the difference between men and women sexually. And so on the part of the slide where it says women, it has a whole bunch of switches and dials and meters and graphs and it just filled with different instrumentation, suggesting how complicated women's sexuality is. And then above that, it says men, and it's a toggle switch that says on off, indicating that men's sexuality is simple, it's straightforward, and a lot of people show that, and it does get sort of some chuckles, as you might imagine. But I show it for a different reason. I show it because I think this is a slide that actually does a real disservice to men. Men are emotional. Men have emotions. They express them differently. They may manifest themselves differently. A lot of times, and one of the things I talk about in a lot of my lectures and in my book, I talk about how the penis speaks. For a lot of men, when their penises are not working well or are behaving badly, it oftentimes is a man's way of communicating distress, vulnerability, anxiety, threats to existence, and we don't recognize it as anything more than sex. I think it was Billy Crystal, I'm not positive, but I believe it was Billy Crystal who, he's very funny, but he once said, women need a reason to have sex, men just need a place. It's funny, but it's not true. And any sex therapist who works with men will tell you that those men that are sitting in front of us, they're not sitting there with swagger, they're not cavalier about it, they are really suffering emotionally, and it's coming out in sexual difficulties and conflicts. So I think, that too will have an advantage for not only a professional audience, but for the general public, as well, to just, we need to challenge this traditional role of male sexuality as, ready anytime, all the time, sexual machines, that, men's sexual behavior is all about power and oppression. Sometimes, I'm not saying that doesn't exist, but it's much, much more complicated than that for the vast majority of men that we see in psychotherapy.
I can start. Oh, yeah. Heather, when you were just mentioning that, you're right. The word conference can be like kind of heavy and like, but so two words came up for me: the collective and the conversation. Right? Because really that's what this is. Like we are, on the cutting edge of what does this new masculinity paradigm look like? And so again, like to anybody who's listening, anybody who's like, yeah, it kind of sounds interesting, but it's a conference. I don't know if it's for me. It's like, you're part of the collective. Welcome to the conversation. We need your perspective because again, like Christopher said, this is a mosaic. This is a conversation that's evolving and we need the collective's voice. We need attendees. We obviously have the panel of everybody has their unique aspect and their unique view, but obviously all the attendees are going to be part of the collective conversation about the evolution of masculinity. And that's really why it matters that you attend this conference, because we need your voice.
And I would say a couple of things about the general public. One is I have met a lot of young men and boys who believe they're going to use their fathers and their grandfathers' formulas to get along in the world. And it's not your father's world, and it's not your grandfather's world. And if you look back at your father's and your grandfather's formulas, you might find out that they didn't especially always work for them either. The other thing about it, about the dryness and everything, I'll just speak for myself. I am a former stand-up comedian. I'm an actor. I have a stage show on masculinity. I have never done a presentation that is not accessible to people, and you will laugh until you stop. So I think it's important to have some fun while you're learning, and it's been very much central to my career. And just listening to the other speakers speak, I mean, I didn't hear anything overly academic or dry or anything else. Everybody knows how to talk to people. And so I think that it's going to be very accessible. And I'm really looking forward to the whole exploration, and as Christopher said, to all these different kinds of angles that we all have.
I would like to say thank you, Crystal, for bringing in the word collective. This is a word I use a lot when I talk about, like, as we do this work on ourselves, whether we're clinicians or whether we're the general public or whether we're in academia, like when we do this work on ourselves, we help the collective. And the more people we have together, the more experts we have thinking about this and talking about this is great. And also, I spend all day talking to regular people. I imagine most of you do as well, no matter what your clinical practice is. Like, we're talking to everyday people who are in relationship or want to be in relationship or are having sex or want to be having sex or want to understand themselves in new ways. And so, yes, even though it sounds like a very academic conference, it's going to be stuff that's going to impact your daily life, your daily relationships, and hopefully give you tips and practices and things to think about so that you can take those home, put them into practice, have better conversations with your lovers or partners or friends, and really take this wisdom out into the collective. Because when we work on ourselves, then we support everyone else.
I'd love to add on to that. There is a truism in the work that I do as a therapist where nobody comes into my practice to brag about how great life is going, right? And so they come in because I'm in pain in a certain part of my life, or I'm not having the kind of sex I want to have, or I'm really distressed about it. And I come in and I work with a therapist until I get to sort of the baseline level of functioning that I wanted. Well, geez, that's not going to inspire anybody to tune into a conference. What I want to say is there is something beyond healing. There is joy out there. There is better sex out there. There is pride in yourself as a man and as a lover of men. There is a path forward to joy again. And I think in this conference, you're going to get a template for that from a lot of different angles. And parts of that are going to resonate to you as an audience member, and parts aren't. So I will say to people, come consume all of it. Take what works for you, leave what doesn't, because joy lies on the other side, folks. But we've got to start by confronting some of the really difficult parts. Chris said, confronting the parts of our past and our histories that worked for us, and really those that didn't. But after the confrontation, there's joy on the other side. So that's what I would say to the general public is come for the healing, stay through, and get to the joy.